I'm going to introduce you to my co-lead for Vision Aware. Her name is Pris Rogers, and she is going to talk to you a little bit more about the people who will be presenting for us today. Pris, are you?
I am here,
Take it
Melanie.
away. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you very much. We have two wonderful presenters today, and I have up on the screen the picture of Deborah Kendrick, MA, who is AccessWorld Senior Features Editor. And I think she's been with AccessWorld for 21 years, something like that. It started out as Tactic, which was a quarterly magazine that she created, and then she was the editor of that, and then that was subsumed by the American Foundation for the Blind, and she started working with AccessWorld. She's also been an award-winning writer and editor and poet, and has written all sorts of things, so much I can't possibly even talk about it. We would talk about that all day. She's done so much work. And she's written for Women's Day and Marriage and Family, a whole host of different types of magazines and so forth. She's also received several awards, including the FB Access Award, among many, many, many. And we also have Bill Holton with us. Bill is a freelance magazine writer. He also writes for AccessWorld, and he told me today that he's written for AccessWorld since 2013. So not quite as long as Deborah, but certainly a long time. And he has written for AccessWorld. He's written over 110 articles. So he's been quite prolific in his work. He says he's been using a screen reader and other voice technology for over 35 years. And in addition to working for writing for AccessWorld, he writes for Women's World. So he is, again, a very prolific writer, just like Deborah. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah to talk about a life of using Braille.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Pris, and thank you, Melanie and Pris, for putting this together, because we are going to talk about my favorite subject. I say that Braille is basically in my DNA. It is part of who I am, and part of everything that I have done in my life is somehow connected with Braille, with my ability to read and write Braille. So I'll tell you a little bit about me and my relationship with Braille, if you will, and then a little bit about Braille itself. So I have been blind since I was 5 years old. I had a rare childhood cancer. It's called retinoblastoma, and was completely blind by about 1 year before I was to start the first grade. My parents knew that I would read with my fingers, but they didn't know much else. So the first reading experience that I remember, my father cut letters from paper and capital print letters. And I have always been very, very grateful for that, because so I learned those print letters when I was maybe 3 or 4 and was tracing them by touch, even when I had a little bit of vision left. And so I fell in love with letters pretty early on. Well, then a resource classroom opened in our city, which was Toledo, Ohio. And a resource classroom is a model that we used to use in public schools, where a small number of children would be with a teacher who was a teacher of what we now call TVI, teacher of the visually impaired. And you would be with her as much as needed. So in my case, I came in the first grade and I began learning Braille and learning to read, and I just flew into reading. And I think that's just the way my brain was wired. I would have flown into reading had I still had sight. So the way the model worked was that we were sent down the hall to be with the other children as soon as we were able to do what they did. And in my case, I've always been very proud of the fact that the first gratification, if you will, of being able to read so well was that I was reading with the sighted kids a few months into first grade, and I was a bluebird. You remember? when you were little, and I think it was a very common model in classrooms to divide the readers into the bluebirds and the redbirds and maybe some other bird, but the bluebirds were the ones who really soared. So that's my intro to reading Braille. And immediately my world very much revolved around reading. All of my childhood memories have to do some way or another with reading. I started writing when I was maybe 7, and I like to say I never stopped. I knew from the time of being a very young child that I wanted to be a writer when I grew up. Braille has been, for me, it's not just about books. Everything, as I said, everything that I have done has been connected with Braille. When I went to high school and I was the only blind kid there and nobody knew how to get books, I took voluminous notes with a Braille slate and stylus, which was the first way I learned to write Braille. That's a metal or plastic frame that has Braille cells embossed into it, and with a stylus, which is a small tool, to punch the dots, you punch the ones that are necessary to form the Braille letters. When I was a child, I'm very grateful that I learned that at the same time the sighted kids were learning cursive writing. So in 2nd grade, I was learning to write with a slate and stylus. And to jump a field a minute to say one thing about incentives for older adults, from the time that I was a little kid, sighted kids wanted to learn how that Braille stuff worked that I was doing. I remember coming home in 2nd grade with my slate and stylus and teaching my younger brother, who was only 4, to write Braille. And later, as a parent of sighted children, my sighted children all wanted to learn and their friends wanted to learn. So it's got a fun element to it if you're a little kid, and the puzzle element. So we'll talk a little bit more after Bill has introduced himself, but about Braille itself. But I want to say that my ability to write Braille throughout high school, college, graduate school, teaching, and of course my freelance writing career, I couldn't have done any of those things without the ability to write Braille and to write it very rapidly. In college, my notes were frequently better than my sighted friends' notes because I used a shorthand system called Grade 3 Braille and was able to write very rapidly on thin paper. And as a mom and a parent, a community activist, everything that I've done has had Braille. There's Braille on everything in my life, from the appliances to the shampoo bottles to what color my kids' clothes were, they had Braille labels on them. And of course, all of the children's books that I have collected over the years, reading not only to my own children, but to lots of other children. And we'll talk more about that later. But as Pris said, I'm a full-time freelance writer, and all of the writing that I do, I take Braille notes, I do my research in Braille, and I should point out that particularly for people with additional sensory loss, if you have a hearing impairment, being able to read Braille has added benefits, as it has for me, because that is part of my history, is a lifelong hearing impairment as well. So that's the Deborah Kendrick Loves Braille story. And let's hear about Bill, and then we'll get back into talking about Braille itself.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank everybody else for being here and inviting me. I am 67 years old, born in 53 with congenital glaucoma, the pressure was building and my eyes got a little larger than normal, but I could see pretty much normally through, I'd say about 12 or 13, at which time the cornea started to deteriorate a little and I could only read, most of the day. And then there were a few hours when I couldn't, but I was always a big reader. I would take my $1.25 and ride to the mall to get my Tom Swift Jr. book and bring home as many books as I could from the library and just lay in bed reading until late at night. And so as my vision began to deteriorate, and when I was about 13 or so, there weren't a lot of services available that I or my parents were aware of. So I kind of faked it. I told the teachers I couldn't see the board, even though I was sitting up front, and I could still read most of the tests and everything. But couldn't really read a lot of the textbooks at night. But luckily, I was able to fake it. So going on, I was about 15, I think, when I had the first rehab teacher that came to work with me. And at that point, I wasn't really interested in Braille so much as I was in typing, because I had not taken typing at school and I knew I was going to need to learn typing to go to college. And so that was my primary focus. And by then they were trying to get me tapes of books, my textbooks, but again, this is back in the mid 60s, they weren't available. My first experience at Rehab Center was when I was 16 in Arkansas, and there I had a Braille class. I remember the big old book with the brown cover that started out with the 1 dot for A and 2 for B and 3 for C. And I spent the summer, I wasn't really motivated to do that. I was more motivated for typing, and I was fascinated by the abacus. And I just didn't think I was getting it. But then finally I was able to get the alphabet. And I learned the alphabet, and then I absolutely never used it. I came home, I could get the books on big old reels they had at the time and talking books, and I was still an avid reader, but now I was listening. And thinking back, most of my schooling was listening because I never really took notes. I listened and kind of retained and that sort of thing. So Braille just kind of slipped away. And when I was in college, Voc Rehab, in its infinite wisdom, waited till I finished college and finished grad school to get me a video magnifier, which was nice of them, 5 years too late. But I had a few accidents where I bumped into things and lacerated my eye. And this was in the mid 70s. And I was using the video magnifier to write, and my little Selectric typewriter, and I would do a couple of paragraphs and get almost to the end and screw it up and tear the sheet out and throw it behind me, and I had literal snowdrifts of papers. And then when I get it right, I take it into the other room with the magnifier and correct it there. And just as I'm about to lose even that ability, it kind of overlapped. I heard about the first talking computers, and this was an Apple IIe, and I just fell in love. This was what I needed. My brain just wasn't wired for Braille. Even to this day, when I am listening to something, either text on a computer or a book, I have like words flashing in front of me. And if I read too long, I get eye strain because my eyes are still bouncing back and forth like there are words on the page. And I've learned Braille 3 times now. The last time was about 20 years ago. I had moved into an apartment and I was going to be all kinds of independent, and I got the Braille labeler, and I started out by labeling all of my spices. And it was just easier just to open the lid and smell what was in it. So I've always found ways to around it, either using tape recorders or typing things out. You know, I always had all of my notes, my class notes back in school, I would write with a felt marker, and then I would go to where I had a bright light and read them onto a recorder. So, you know, that was the way I did that. And then I had a recorder, you know, I always had a recorder handy to, excuse me? Can you guys hear me? Oh.
Yeah, that was, yeah, that was me. I was just going to jump in, but finish.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay, because this is what's great about our doing this in the sort of free-form way that we are, is that many of the things that you're saying are helping shape the kinds of things that I wanted to point out. So, and how our brains are wired has so much to do with learning or not learning Braille. But I wanted to just, so we're talking about computers at the same time and talking about what Braille looks like. I just want to jump into that because Bill, being the comedian that he is, said Braille A for 1 dot for A, 2 for B, and 3 for C. And I know he knows better than that, but because it is not 3 dots for C. But I do want to talk a little bit about Braille itself for those who have not learned or had much exposure to Braille. It is called Braille because it was invented by Louis Braille, a Frenchman who lost his sight at the age of 3. And he was born in 1809 and invented the Braille code based on another code that he was introduced to when he was a teenager. I think it's very, to me, just a dazzling fact that it was invented by a teenager. I think that's pretty wonderful because he wanted to read and he wanted to write down his thoughts. And so that's how that came to be. But the Braille code is based on a 6-dot cell, a rectangle, 3 dots on the left and 3 dots on the right. And I have noticed over the years teaching, particularly teaching adults, children learn Braille the way children learn print. It's, you know, symbol looks like this, that's a, you know, a V, and when it's when the word letters come together like this, it's the word cat. But adults, of course, who already have reading in their brains, reading those lines and squiggles we call print, need another approach to learning because they already know how to read and spell. So I have noticed that people who are 3 different characteristics that seem to bring people in to be good Braille readers. People who appreciate math, people who appreciate music, and people who appreciate puzzles. And I think there have been some scientific connections made between math and music, and therefore Braille, that there are areas of the brain that relate to those things. And so those are things to keep in mind if you or someone you know is an older adult, that if a person appreciates music, appreciates math, or enjoys solving puzzles, then Braille will work. I wanted to touch on the business of Braille and computers because that is such an enormous breakthrough in our lifetimes. As Bill said, computers 35 years ago. So for me, that first computer was in fact a refreshable Braille device. And in 1985, the Versa Braille, which was not the first, but the first widely known and commercially available Braille, refreshable Braille device. So refreshable Braille is still Braille and still based on the Braille cell, but as your screen constantly refreshes and changes, so a Braille display's screen, if you will, constantly refreshes and changes. And until when I got my first Versa Braille, I was already somewhat established. I had sold some magazine pieces, some newspaper pieces, and I was putting together the first issue of Tactic magazine. And I had done all of that writing manually with a Perkins Braille writer. And I did it by writing drafts in Braille, reading them into a tape recorder, and then typing from my own reading listening to the tape. So the first time I had my hands on a refreshable Braille display and I could write, come over to the house and think, I want to insert yellow house, and that I could insert yellow house. Or when I saw that I wrote, this is an interesting document instead of document, because I reversed vowels, I could change it on the fly. It was amazing that I could read a page and realize this paragraph is really stupid. I want to take it out, or I want to embellish this a little bit more with some more adjectives. I could do it all by myself, and I could do it without having to tear up pages as we had done before. So that's the beauty of refreshable Braille. And
let me point out another beauty of refreshable Braille, if I could, Deb, and that is when I was growing up and trying to do Braille, what you would see would be like Braille labels on talking books and stuff, and they were unreadable. But you know, refreshable Braille, you're going to have a standard dot. If you're going to learn it, you know, on a Braille keyboard or I mean, a refreshable Braille, the dots are going to feel the same. You're not going to have something that's half worn out and or done on a piece of notebook paper or something like that. Sorry, Deb, go ahead, Deborah.
That's exactly right. And today is this wasn't planned to be a part of this webinar, but it's so relevant. Today, we are on the brink of refreshable Braille being put into the hands of more Americans than at any other time in our history, because the National Library Service for the Blind, where most blind people begin their journey with blindness, getting talking books, was allocated, money was allocated by Congress 4 years ago for the National Library Service to provide Braille e-readers. And what Braille e-readers are refreshable Braille devices to which you download your Braille books in the same way that you download your talking books to the talking book player. And right now we are launching the second of 2 pilots. So there are 2 devices, and already hundreds of people are testing them in 5 different states, and soon are going to be added to that. So in the foreseeable future, any individual who is eligible for service from the National Library Service can also receive a refreshable Braille display. And I think it's going to be a huge breakthrough for people learning Braille as older adults, or who maybe, like you, learned the alphabet but didn't have any opportunity to really practice it
I think that still goes, though. First of all, let me say you were right about the puzzle people, because that first summer I learned Braille, I got nowhere until all of a sudden one day it occurred to me, hey, there's a pattern to this. And then I went through the whole book in 2 days. So, you know, the puzzle aspect is there, but learning Braille is like any new skill. There is a commitment. There is a time commitment. There is a practice commitment. And if you're going to learn Braille, you're going to start, you know, you're going to want to jump into War and Peace. And what you're going to be practicing on is I guess the modern equivalent of C spot, C, you know, C John, C Jill. So even though, you know, the talking book is going to be Braille, you're going to be reading so slowly at first that you're going to be impatient. Now, this is not why you shouldn't learn Braille, because with any skill, it's going to take practice. And you know, with any skill, at first you're going to give up and say, I can't do it. Now, there may be medical reasons you can't do it. You know, diabetes may have lost your sensitivity in your fingertips, but it's a skill, and it's going to require some time and priority. And so it may be a priority, but if it's not a priority, my feeling is it's not a necessity if it's not a priority. But that's for the individual to decide.
Let's talk about the different levels of literacy, how Braille, now, okay, very clearly for me, Braille is on everything, all of the information that I access, I'm reading in Braille. Everything in my house has Braille on it. I can't imagine not having a Braille watch on my wrist so I can look at the time without everyone knowing that I'm looking at the time. But then, so that's what works for me. And I don't want to say that that is not a possibility for an 80-year-old person, because not many, but I personally have known a few individuals who have learned Braille and become very fluent as very significantly older adults. But if you're a person and you're in your 60s or 70s and you say, I just can't learn a whole new system, I get that. I mean, I never have become fluent in any languages. And for the record, Braille is not a language. It is not a language. It is a system of reading. It is a code, if you will, but it is not a language because it's identical, word for word, punctuation mark for punctuation mark to the print that it reflects. But I don't think that I could learn to speak French fluently at this point, but I could learn a little bit of French. I could learn conversational French. I couldn't become a virtuoso on the cello, but I could learn to play the ukulele. So my point is that learning any new skill is a definite benefit. There's been a lot of research indicating that one very significant way of keeping our brains active is learning new material. So forging new pathways in your brain by learning a new skill. So maybe you're not going to become fluent, literate, be that person who can read 500 words a minute in Braille and outshine your print reading partner. But functional literacy, there is so much to be said for just functional literacy. And what I mean by that is, let's say you just learn the Braille alphabet and you learn how to read and write the Braille alphabet. Well, with that, you could put labels on your medication or on your spices, as Bill mentioned earlier. Or if you've always been a card shark, you can still play cards. And just learning to read playing cards, I think is a huge incentive for many people to learn to read Braille. It makes me so sad when I hear someone say, I used to play games a lot, but I can't play games anymore because I can't read. Blindness is.
And I will agree there, because that was one of my, in our outlines, that was one of the things I was going to say, is that, everybody should try to learn Braille, but accept it that it's a challenge. And if it's a challenge you want to take, Deborah, you said, you could learn enough French. Maybe it's because you want to go visit Paris, in which case you have a motivation, or maybe just an arbitrary goal. So maybe you want to learn enough Braille to be able to play a game of cards or a game of Scrabble, or maybe it's just an intellectual challenge to keep your mind sharp. So, these are reasons to learn Braille. But again, if you choose not to, that doesn't make you less of a blind person. It doesn't make you any less literate.
Right. And I think one of the incentives for me in doing this webinar with you in particular was that I tend to be kind of elitist about writing and writers and who I consider a writer. And I admire your writing a great deal. And when we have had our AccessWorld team meetings, and I know that I'm taking all my notes in Braille and I'm reading, reading what others are sending out. I'm reading those things in Braille, and I have thought, how does Bill do this? So do you label anything in Braille? Do you have any tactile means of identifying your folders or your notes or anything of that sort?
My notes are on the computer. It's not in my inbox. It doesn't exist. My medications are in different size bottles. And to tell you the truth, finding the big bottle is easier than reading the Braille.
So, I think what a challenge I would like to take on is, to see if we could get you to revisit the Braille alphabet and try it one more time now that there are these refreshable Braille devices that are affordable and soon going to be free from the library. What would you think of that? Would you?
I plan to get one just to play with it, sure. But I play with a lot of things. I have priorities right now. One of my priorities is an arbitrary priority of playing guitar. So I have my own priorities, and I don't see a lot of need for Braille. But I don't see a need to play guitar, but that's the one I've chosen to devote my mental energy to, because I like playing guitar. I actually find that I write better hearing it, because if I can hear a sentence, I will know that there's a word missing. Even though, the sentence structure is fine, I will know that there's a word missing. And if you're going to deliver a speech, you always read it first. Read it out loud first, because it sounds different and it improves it. So I just find that writing is much easier with sound.
So to play kind of devil's advocate, but really not so much, because
you're a devil. Go ahead.
Because I am a devil. Exactly. Great minds think alike. Okay. So thinking, giving a speech is a perfect example. I have given hundreds of speeches, and 9 times out of 10, except today, because the way we're doing this didn't work to write it out. I write speeches out the way I write an article. I write from start to finish, and I print it out on Braille paper. And I have given things where I'm standing in front of hundreds of people, and people always say to me that they had no idea I was reading. They had no idea I was reading. Why did they have no idea that I was reading? Because I'm not looking down at the paper. I'm looking at the audience, and my hands are on the paper, but big deal, my hands are moving, no one's noticing. And I have been told that countless times, that people have no idea that I'm reading. Okay, so, and it's to my mind, a definite advantage, because I can either read word for word, as I have done most of the time, or I can just have notes, but I can still have my hands on my notes, and my eyes, even though they don't work, are on the audience. And so everyone is comfortable. And another example, mentioning guitar, when I started, when I was in college, I played guitar and I played in coffee houses and so forth. And I would keep lists of songs in my guitar case, just lists of titles to remind me, oh, you know, you played this song, now here's another song, here's another song, so that the pressure wasn't on my brain. So my question to you is, how do you do that? How do you access information in a group situation when, say, you know, you're presenting to people or even just interacting with people without having to consult a talking device that's going to say, you know, here is your list. Of course, it's much better because we don't have such computerized voices in our devices as we did 20 years ago. But what's your alternative?
I don't have the priority to get in front of a lot of people and speak. If I did, if that were part of my career, then I might be motivated enough to do that.
Okay. Okay, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. Let's talk about, I think you were going to talk about just the psychosocial advantages and disadvantages, and we've kind of done that already.
Yeah, the advantages are, you know, you're going to keep your mind sharp, and for as you grow older, you look for things to help you keep your mind sharp. I mean, a lot of people will do, you know, crosswords and such like that. This is a way to keep your mind sharp. On the contrary, you may already have some deficits in remembering or in your abilities to touch, and it may become another source of frustration. You're already frustrated that, you know, you can't drive anymore, and now, you know, you don't want to feel frustrated because you're not a good enough blind person, because you don't know Braille. And there are people, and Deborah, you know this, who will say, if you don't know Braille, you're an illiterate. Yes. And that's kind of like Braille shaming. And I don't think, I'm heartily against that. So, and, you know, if you're losing your sight and you're retired, you got a lot of time to fill. And if this is a way you could, you know, fill your time and learn something useful and find a way to use it that appeals to you, then it can only, you know, help with your personhood, you know, to say, this is a way that I am compensating or rehabbing myself or emerging from what I used to be to what I am now. And you can play cards with your grandkids.
Well, I think a point where I want to strongly disagree with you is that I don't think that this sense of, well, if you're retired and you have oodles and oodles of time. I have had people who have been losing vision for many years tell me that with regard to a lot of blindness things. Well, I'll learn O&M when I lose more vision or have more time. I will learn Braille when I lose more vision or I have more time. And I think that if you, yes, to read complicated, if you want to read Harper's Magazine in Braille every month and you're going to read all of the classic American literature, well then, yeah, learning Braille is going to take you some time to get to that level. But for just functional, for playing cards, playing Scrabble, brailing your spices, putting Braille reminders on how, so you don't have to memorize all those remote controls, which button is which. You can make a little Braille chart to help you remember which button to push for Netflix, okay? So, and that's, you know, functional literacy. To learn Braille at that level does not take intensive amounts of time. You said yourself that when you were a kid and you went to that program, you learned the alphabet in 2 days. And that's right. I have sat down with many 6-year-olds, shown them a Braille alphabet card, a Braille slate and stylus, and they are writing me a note within an hour, half hour. It is because the alphabet itself is very systematic and very quickly learned.
Agreed, but you have to have the opportunity to practice it. And if in your
Yes.
life you're not going to practice it, then all that learning is going to do is make you feel like, you know, I'm wasting my time, or I've wasted my time, or I'm not good enough because I can't read Braille 2, which is how I think most of the talking books are going to come on, isn't it?
I want to mention a couple of, in the event that people are thinking, well, how would I learn and where would I learn? There's are a lot of good tools, but I want to mention just a few that I think are particularly good. I'm not sure that it's still available, but there is an inexpensive device. It's not a device, it's just it's a manual board about 8 inches long and 1.5 inches high, and it has pegs, and it has holes drilled into it that are the 6-dot Braille cell, 10 of them, 10 Braille cells across, and pegs that you push up and down to have the pegs up that you want up. So you can put 10 letters on this thing, but it's constantly changing, and it's called a peg slate, and I used to get them from the American Printing House whenever I was teaching adults, but they're fun for kids. Like when kids see them, they immediately want to start playing with them, because it's sort of like, not quite like a Rubik's Cube, but you know, you push the pegs up and down and up and down, and you can make the different letters. So and again, anything that's a little bit fun, I think is a plus. So that's one tool. And there are a number of books available, but one really inexpensive book that I have used a lot, it's like $10 from the National Federation of the Blind Independence Market, called the McDuffie Reader. And it's written for adults, and it's 1 Braille volume. And if you work through that, conceivably you could work through it on your own, but it's better if you can work through it with a teacher, or if not a professional, at least someone who knows Braille who can work through it with you. So
there's a tool that a lot of people here probably already have, and that's the iPhone. Can't you have a Braille keyboard you can use with your fingers, and you can try it that way?
Yes. Yeah.
So you don't need to do anything but pull out your phone.
That's right. It's a native app to the Apple iPhone, and it's called Braille Screen Input. And it's a little tricky to get used to it. Talk about puzzles. That's a puzzle to solve, is getting your fingers in the right place so that it calibrates to your fingers, so that it knows you're touching 6 dots instead of only 5. But it's a really fun thing to play around with. And you're right, that could be a great way of getting instant feedback while learning Braille. So I know, what else have you got, Bill, before we open it up to people's questions and comments?
If I were doing it again and I were back in the 60s before technology, I probably should have used Braille. I would not have had the term gifted underachiever hung around my neck so often. But now that this stuff is available, I think that it's a choice now. And one choice is not better than the other. And it's up to you. I mean, I would try it. And if it doesn't work, you have other ways. Find something that works for you and be proud of that.
Well, what do you think, Melanie? Do we have some questions? Melanie.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they disconnected an hour ago.
I thought you left us.
No, I'm here. I just had to get to the mute button. So we haven't had any questions except for how to find a stylist, which I think we answered in the chat. But I think it's a good time to go ahead and open up for questions if you guys are ready.
And I do want to talk about Style for a moment because
Sure, go ahead.
There are dozens and dozens of different kinds of styluses. When I was a kid, the ones that I learned were round wooden things that fit into the palm of your hand. But since then, there have been lots of others. And I don't even know where I got it, but I have a little notebook that is always with me. It's just a little leather folder that's maybe 5x8 and fits 5x8 notepads that you can buy by the hundreds at Office Depot. And in there, I have a little slate because slates come in all different sizes too. The slate I keep in that is a 6-line slate that has, I don't know, maybe, I don't even know how many cells and I'm not looking at it right now, but maybe 15 to 20 cells across. But what I love is I have this flat stylus that is probably, it's a piece of wood that's probably a 1/4 inch thick. So it's completely flat and can live inside that folder. I'm not sure, but I think you can get those from the NFB Independence Market. The American Printing House has what they call saddle styluses, which are similar, but they're not quite as thin. So I did want to point that out because getting a stylus that's comfortable in your hand will have some bearing on how much you pursue working with a slate and stylus. Well, and the other thing that I should have mentioned earlier, Braille paper is paper that's called Braille paper is cardstock. It's like 100 pound. I personally have not used Braille paper since I was a child, unless I'm writing something that I really need to be sure that the other person I'm sending it to might not be able to read it unless I put it on Braille paper. But you can write Braille on any paper, and as long as you don't put any bricks on top of it to smash it, you're still going to be able to read it. So for that, when I was in college and graduate school, I just used the spiral notebooks that you can buy anywhere. And that's how I took my notes. And today, as I said, if I have to write down a phone number or a to-do list or a reminder, I just use standard notepads that you can buy anywhere. And they're thin, so you can punch very rapidly because, I'm lazy. I don't want to have to punch so hard through that heavy paper. So, okay.
We do have a couple of people with raised hands. So if you guys are ready, I will go ahead and start with the first one I see is Audrey. I am going to unmute you, Audrey, and you should be able to unmute yourself, actually, is what it's telling me here. Let's see, you should have, there you go.
By mistake. Sorry.
Oh, you didn't have a question? Okay, no
No,
worries.
sorry.
Not a problem. Okay, the next one then is, it looks like Lauren. There you go. You should have a prompt to unmute yourself.
That was by mistake also, sorry.
Oh, okay, no worries. Let's try Mike. Go ahead and ask your question if you'd like, if you have one.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
can.
Wonderful.
Hi.
Yeah, well, I just want to say you guys are great, and I've enjoyed this discussion. The thing is, there's a lot of technology, high tech, low tech, that blind folks just are not always able to get their hands on and really learn. Braille is just one of them. In California, if you want to learn Braille, there are a few places where you can go, which is great. We have some private agencies with Braille teaching. They have to be funded, but they are. And then, of course, we have a couple of rehab centers where adults can learn Braille, and newly visually impaired adults take a crack at it. They don't always become what you were referring to as literate, but they may make some use of Braille. Bill, this business of being a good blind person, I know what you're saying, and I've heard that too. But you know what? I've never really found it to be a particularly big social deal, any more than, you know, somebody not liking the way you dress or something like that. I mean, we do that to each other in society, which is unfortunate. But anyway, I know a lot of people who tell me, I just don't think I'll be using Braille. And I'm glad for them that there are alternatives. However, I'm kind of like Deborah. All my life I've used Braille, and I've never really had a Braille display of my own until fairly recently, and I'm pretty old. So it's not as though it's been all that accessible, available. So I get it that people have structured their lives without it. But I would say, I mean, within arm's length of where I am right now is just no end of the use of Braille. I do it all the time. But tell me, do you really feel this social pressure?
I hear it a lot of times. I hear people saying that unless you know Braille, you're not going to get a job and things like that. I don't feel it, you know, from friends or whatever. And to tell you the truth, I don't know. I don't actively engage on a daily basis with a lot of blind individuals. But I know it's out there. And, you know, even Deborah agrees that she's heard it too. And a lot of times, and I understand where it's coming from, because my impression is that
I live with myself. If I didn't throw this fact in there, because you are successful and you do what you do very well without Braille, but it is relevant to note that research has been done that has illustrated that even though we have this deplorable unemployment rate, that something like 90% of the blind people who are employed use Braille. And that's not something.
I would like to see further research that separates those individuals who are blind from birth and those who have become blinded later. And because my sense, and I have no numbers to back this up, but my sense are that the people who are most adamant about Braille have known it since they were 3, 4, and 5, and that's completely understandable. I can get it, you know, I can understand their point of view. That's what they've learned. They don't see how they could ever survive without it. So ergo, you can't survive without it. Now, I would be interested in a survey that really did talk to people who, didn't have vision problems until their 40s or their 50s, and see what they have to say.
I think
It's
that's a
never
good
really
a
idea.
separate.
couple other questions.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
see if we can get
Okay.
these other couple questions in. First, we
Go ahead.
have Matthew. You can unmute yourself if you'd like. And then we have
Hello.
another.
Hello.
Hello, go ahead.
Hi.
Hello, I just want to say hello to everybody. I think these things are great. We were talking about the blind technology. I do have one of the WeWalk canes. I don't know if anybody is familiar with it. It's one of those talking canes you hook up to your phone or your iPad, and it gives you the turn-by-turn directions. You can program it. They are really, really good. But on the unfortunate part, these things are expensive. And a lot of this great technology for the blind is really expensive. What I would like to say is I wish there was a way we can make this affordable, or at least let us make payments on it, like the new Oricam glasses, the WeWalk cane, and just even trying to get Merlin readers and things like that.
It's a
Those
matter
are
of
very-
scale. It's a matter of scale. I mean, an iPhone, you pay no more for the iPhone with accessibility. Now you can pay no more for a Windows computer without accessibility. But things like the Orcam, until they make so few of them,
Yeah,
that
that
they
is
can't
true.
spread the research cost and the cost out. It just can't be
It
done.
would be nice. It would be nice, but there is one thing I do recommend that WeWalk cane. It really helps, and it detects objects. Because I like to be outside. I'm an
Okay.
outdoorsman, and I do a lot of that. But again, it's a $600 cane. Some people don't have that money, but I was just thinking, maybe we can all try to, again, to start maybe petitioning, and if we can all just get things to make affordable, at least have insurance try to cover some of the costs.
Great. Thank you so much for mentioning
Thank you,
that,
Matt.
Matthew. We need to get on to other Braille questions, though.
Yes, thank you for your
All
time.
right. Next up is Gail. Gail, if you'd like to unmute, I believe, oh, it just kind of bounced out of the way. Are you able to unmute?
Hello, can you hear
There
me?
you go. Yes, yes. Sorry about that. Go
Okay,
ahead.
I have a question. I'm a rehab teacher and I work with a lot of students. And my question, which I've not ever gotten anybody to answer, is when they've been learning Braille, when do you introduce a computer with a keyboard versus staying with their refreshable Braille and Braille? At what point is that an indicator we should switch them, or should you keep them on Braille?
Why not teach them simultaneously?
And you broke up a little bit, so I'm not completely sure I understand the question. When do you teach typing Braille versus typing QWERTY? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, the QWERTY versus focusing on Braille so they learn Braille and not confuse them with QWERTY, or do you?
I don't think there's any confusion. I think that the brain, and again, this is going to be somewhat different depending on age, but if you think about children, at least when you're a kid, you learn to print, and then you learn cursive maybe, and maybe you learn to throw a ball one way and throw a ball another. You know what I mean? There's more than one way of doing everything that we do as humans. And I think that typing on a Braille keyboard and typing on a QWERTY keyboard, they're two separate things. Just like, when you play the piano, your right hand does one thing and your left does the other. And I've never heard anybody say, well, that's so confusing. It's just the way that process is learned. And people will say, you'll hear long-time typists and long-time Braillists saying that they prefer one method of typing over another. I personally, I switch back and forth without any thought. And for people who want to practice both, there are a lot of applications where you're QWERTY keyboard, you know, the 6 home row keys can become the Braille keyboard, so you can practice typing Braille on the QWERTY keyboard too. Gail, is that addressing what you're asking, or are we missing the point?
Well, I just have a couple of 13, 14-year-olds that they never got introduced to the QWERTY keyboard or the keyboard, and they're still trying to get them to learn Braille. So they
Gee.
used it.
Well,
So I'm trying to get them to do that, and I just don't want to mess them up.
no, you will not be messing them up. They should, it will benefit them so much in
Yeah,
the,
Deborah's right. You can teach handwriting and keyboarding. Why not teach both?
Okay, so I just checking. Thank you.
All right,
Okay.
we have one other question, it looks like, from Alan. If you want to go ahead and unmute, you can ask your question.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, I just want to comment. Y'all have done a great presentation. And the key thing is for everybody to remember, there's multiple ways to learn stuff. And there's not a right or wrong answer here. You know, it's critical for everybody to be literate. And if you're born blind and you need Braille to learn literacy, you got to get on that bandwagon. You got to do it. And you know, if you're like me, you lost your sight later in life. You're already literate, and I'm kind of like Bill. I have a hard time learning Braille, but man, I've got things I can do. I mean, I can keep my mind engaged. I can make the computer sing. I can make the iPhone sing. And do whatever I need it to do. So avoid thinking there's only a right or one right or wrong way to do stuff. When you start thinking that, and you start thinking your way is the only way, that's when we end up having problems, and the same kind of problems the country's having right now. You know, be open-minded and be willing.
We don't want to go there.
Yeah, be open-minded and willing to learn that there's multiple ways to do stuff. There's not one right or wrong. But y'all have done a great job covering the topic, and I just urge everybody to be willing to learn, and you know, whichever way works best for you. That's what to do. So thanks.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? We still have a few moments left. I thought we were getting closer to time, but we do have.
I thought of
wait a minute. We do have a couple other. Go ahead, Deborah, while I'm getting to the other question.
I thought of something else that I wanted to say, and I'll be interested to hear if Bill has an equivalent. One thing that I think about Braille that is sometimes difficult to express to people, and the way that what comes to my mind when I try to express it is something that Dean Blasey told me. So the Braille and Speak was the first portable technological device for blind people that Dean Blasey invented in 1987. So anyone, you know, people who have been born, people here who are under 30 aren't going to remember it, but the Braille and Speak was wildly popular, and it led to so many other devices. And I remember Dean telling me that when he first took it, he took it to the ACB and NFB conventions to introduce it to people to see what they thought. And he said, I never realized how personal Braille was. It was so personal to people. They just, you know, they responded so well. So that's one way of putting it. When I think about that, if someone writes me a note in Braille, if I get a birthday card and someone wrote Braille on it, I don't even have words for how much more that means to me. This year at Christmas, I went to my daughter's for Christmas, and this hasn't always been the case, but for some reason this year she decided to put Braille on all my packages. And it's such a small thing, but it meant so much to me. I kept running my fingers over and over the Braille because that's my name, that's her name, it's for me. You know, this birthday card or sympathy card is for me. I can read it, and someone cared enough to. So I'm really curious, Bill, is there any equivalent in your world to that, that something that people might do for you that carries that kind of emotional impact?
I don't, this will sound strange from a writer, but I don't get emotionally involved with too many words. No, but I don't think that means I'm missing anything, because I have other ways that I feel an emotional connection that don't involve that.
Yeah.
But I think that has something to do with the fact that, you know, Braille is interlocked into your brain since you were 5 years old.
Right.
So, you know, when you're listening to a book, I'm listening to a book, I'm seeing words flashing across my inner vision. You're probably seeing Braille. Yeah, so
I am. I'm seeing Braille words. That's exactly right.
So that's
interesting.
The difference. And all I'm saying is that the person who's 40, 50, or 60 may never reach that point where they're seeing Braille. They're going to see words. So
we do have one more question, guys.
That would be, well, okay, let's go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Natalie, go ahead and unmute if you'd like.
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you to you both for your presentations. It was really interesting. I'm a lifelong Braille reader, and also the president of the Canadian Braille Authority. So I guess you know where I stand.
I should mute myself.
But no, I really do appreciate this conversation, because I think, you know, we need to talk more about Braille and these issues. One of the things that I find, just leading up to my question, is that we see a lot of misconceptions about Braille, particularly in the popular media, and just these statements about, you know, Braille being too difficult to learn or not needed anymore because there's so much technology. And what I find as a Braille reader and also as a Braille instructor is that when we then encounter adult Braille learners, what we end up doing is having to confront a lot of that stigma or those misconceptions. And so then there's a lot of intimidation that prevents them from learning Braille more than the Braille code itself. And so I think the practice piece is really important, and just trying to dispel those misconceptions and showing people that if you use Braille every day, it will become easier. And so I'm wondering, Deborah, just so that we can maybe talk about this briefly, can you maybe talk a little bit about maybe one big misconception about Braille that you would like rehabilitation specialists or anyone listening to know about, and how you've addressed that in the past?
First and foremost, I think there is as you say, there's a stigma that it is exceedingly difficult. And I think that if it's not presented as something that's going to be overwhelmingly difficult, then, you know, there's just so much to be said for the mindset about it. The other thing, I think that we've made some progress. I sort of cringed when Bill referred to those big books with the brown covers. When I was a kid, I loved my books so much, but they weren't pretty. And so they didn't have pictures and they didn't look like other people's books. And I've become so aware of that as an adult, raising children and working with children from time to time, and with so much gratitude that today's books for children are the same books with Braille pages inserted in them. And it makes a big difference. Okay, so what does that have to do with adults? Well, I think we're all products of those children we used to be, and we need for Braille to be cool. And Braille is so cool. but we need to find ways to communicate that to our new, if you're a rehab professional and a 55-year-old has just lost her sight and says, I don't know what to do. I've always been such a reader and I'm so dependent on the written word. Well, you could say, you know, well, Braille is really hard. And, you know, at your age, you're probably not going to become fluent. But if you want to, we could learn it. We could, you know, or you could say, you know, this is not a problem. I know of people older than you who have become completely fluent. Braille is wonderful. It's reading. You'll be reading again in 3 months' time. Let's get going. You know,
Can I say
I think
one thing that I don't think Braille teachers realize? And that is, if I'm going to learn, let's pick a skill. Okay, if I'm going to learn the guitar, okay, I am starting from scratch. And every day I learn something I didn't know before. So I am progressing forward. If you have somebody who's been a reader and you're giving them Braille, the first thing you're doing is saying, okay, we have to start from scratch. That's kind of like a teacher, somebody who's going to help you become a better runner is saying, well, I'm going to help you become a better runner. The first thing we're going to do is break both your legs. You know, in the long run, that may make you a better runner, but in the short, you know, it's, I don't think that a lot of teachers understand that they're, you know, they're taking somebody who's had this skill all of their lives and they're saying, we're going to help you keep this skill, but you got to start over.
We have a couple more questions, guys.
Thank you to you both.
All right, Mo, you can unmute yourself and ask your question if you'd like.
I just wanted to share a little comment about, you know, the those that read Braille from birth to those that learn it later on. I had to fight to learn Braille in high school, even though I was legally blind all my entire life, but I had enough vision that I could read print. And so they just wanted me to keep with the print as long as I could. And I think that held me back today. And like my first two children, because I have 4 boys, I only used audiobooks with. Like that was how I read to them, was through other people reading an audiobook. And just this past, actually within the past half a year, I started getting some Braille books to read to my 4-year-old. And it's just a world of difference to read to them from me than for me to read to them through an audiobook. That's somebody else.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that, Mo. All right, we have one more hand raised. Judy, if you would like to unmute yourself, you may ask your question.
Hi, everybody. First, I want to say thank you to Bill and Deborah. This has been great. I just wanted to go back to Natalie's question a little bit and just to make a comment related to that. And I think that oftentimes the general public or people that are not really informed about Braille have this idea that it's either or, that Braille and technology are opposites or contradict each other, or oh, if you learn Braille, you don't need technology, or if you have technology, then you don't need the Braille. But especially now with refreshable Braille and so many technological advances, they can go hand in hand, and it's, you know, so much more. Braille is so much more available to people than ever before. So I just think it doesn't have to be a contradiction, and I think that it can be that they can both go hand in hand, and you can learn both. And as long as it's like others have said here today, you know, for an adult, there has to be something that motivates them to learn it. And I think if rather than place barriers, if we try to eliminate those and try to figure out what motivates that person, why, you know, what is it about learning Braille that is exciting to that person, then they're going to be a lot more successful. So.
Thank you, Judy. That is, you're
Yes, thank you.
exactly right on.
And
One,
sometimes the motivation is just to learn a new skill. I've agreed with that, definitely.
yeah,
We have a couple of comments and questions in the chat I'll read to you. First comment is, Deborah, I love your comments about the importance of functional Braille. The option of learning Braille is vital for adults. That was from Daphne. Also then from Christina, I think it is more like the first thing we are going to do is teach you to walk with these different shoes. She might have been referring to the
Yeah.
running. Then Katie says, I learned to read Braille at 60. Yes, difficult. Yes, doable. But I agree that with everyone that it depends on how we learn and motivation. And yes, Braille should be cool. Then a question that maybe you guys could answer, and then I do see another hand as well. Can you create or inform us of methods of quote unquote writing larger / plastic Braille for seniors that's more affordable than Braille Writer and Versa Braille, easier than the slate or stylus, or more practical than Scotch Braille labels? Is the writing where options are, it's the writing where options are limited. Can you guys, or Deborah, maybe, can you address that?
well, there, you know, I found something recently that somebody, you know, when I said about Braille being personal, someone had written something very special for me in Braille a number of years ago that I rediscovered the other day. And it was done with a jumbo Brailler, which means that the dots were spaced, not spaced in the same way that we're accustomed to with mass-produced Braille. So there used to be a version of the Perkins Brailler that was for producing jumbo Braille.
And then someone did just comment that there's a large print Braille writer through Perkins.
Yeah, their large point is what they mean, I'm sure, rather than
sure
large print. But I don't think there are any large slates. But that did remind me of something else that's kind of funny that I wanted to point out. There's so many cool products coming on the market these days. And one of my newest, most recently encountered favorites are these shirts that you can buy from Two Brothers. That's the name of the company. And it was founded by, in fact, two blind brothers who wanted to create the softest shirt. So they sell t-shirts and short sleeve and long sleeve and crew neck and turtlenecks. But every one of their shirts has the color name embroidered in sort of a jumbo Braille at the right hand hem of the hem that's at the bottom of the shirt. It's on the inside, and you just stick your letters in there and you can read red or yellow or black or blue. And I just think it's such a cool innovation. Anyway, and the large Braille made me think of that because they're embroidery knots, you know, that they've done the Braille with, so they are large.
All right, we have
Can I clear up a little confusion on what I said about breaking legs? And I understand what she's saying about different shoes, and that's true. What I meant was, like, you as a reader, as a longtime reader, you might have been working your way through Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. But when you're learning Braille, you are not going to be reading Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. You're going to go back to much less sophisticated materials. So in that sense, I meant you're breaking their legs. In that, you know, you're going to have to learn to walk again.
Sure. All right.
That is an area where teachers who are here, if you really wanted to fill a need, that's where, and it's better now than it was 20 years ago, but there is such a need for high interest, low complexity Braille materials. Because if you're 40 years old and learning to read Braille after you've been reading print all your life, you don't need some, you know, first grade book for a child. And you also don't need some clunky, boring adult text that's going to put you to sleep, you know. So And I think materials are better than they were 20 years ago. As I said, that McDuffie reader from that NFB sells, it's not great, but the sentences are a bit more interesting than some of the older books.
Yeah, Deborah, Bill, we have one more question from Fahim. You are ready to go.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're from. My name is Fahim. First of all, I do want to appreciate our great presenters, Bill and Deborah. Not to mention, of course, we have the APH team, Amy, Liam, and our great host, Melanie. Thank you so much for coordinating and hosting this webinar. This is a great information. From the user's point of view and from the instructor's point of view, I do want to emphasize that learning Braille is vital. I mean, you can get away with audiobooks and auditory information in personal environment, but when a person is working, when they're in a professional environment, you must be able to spell things correctly, spell words correctly, whether you're a coder, whether you're a secretary, whether you're a person who is entering data. As long as you're using a keyboard, you must know how to spell things. And if your documents and your data and your works are being misspelled all the time, it's going to be noticed. You will, you won't hear it immediately, but if it's consistent, you'll know it, so that could jeopardize your job. So it's very important that a person knows how to read Braille. And of course, nowadays we have Braille, refreshable Braille displays. If we can't find the materials that we want our kids to read, it's better, you can use either Braille Blaster or other Braille programs to create custom materials and print it using the Braille embossers. That's one thing I highly emphasize. Last but not the least, as far as the seniors are concerned, it's hard to teach Braille to seniors because a lot of them like, well, what am I going to read? What am I going to do? Well, at least get them to the elevator Braille, because a lot of times I'm sure you guys have experienced or know that cell phone services do not work in the elevator. And in the case of emergency, if they need to find the call button or the alarm button, it's labeled in Braille most often. So at least they'll know how to find the button and press it to notify the emergency personnel that, hey, my elevator is stuck and I can't move anywhere. We need help. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Fahim. And we are right at time. So to respect everyone's time, I'm going to end the recording. I want to thank you all so very much for joining us today. Thank you also to Deborah and Bill for your wonderful presentation.